In today's training culture, deloads are being hated on. They're being called a waste of time, a time period where you're not progressing. There are people out there who never deload, or at least that is what they say. We all need deloads. We can't just go 110% at it all the time. It might just be that what these people do are unplanned deloads, or their training in that period is not as easy as what would be categorized as a deload. It might just be a very slight reduction in training load or volume. In today's video, I'm going to give you the best tips I have for deloading properly, where you get rid of fatigue and you get newfound motivation and energy, and you don't lose strength, so you can go in and perform the best you possibly can in the gym after. A deload is a slight reduction in training volume or workload, as the word itself says, deload. The usual recommendations for deloading are to have the intensity at 70 to 80% of what it usually is, and drop the volume down to something around 60 to 70%. But it depends on more things than that. You might also want to drop the frequency down if you have things coming in the way. And for that reason, you're not going to drop the volume or intensity as far down within the individual training, because just the fact that you are doing less workouts during the week obviously drops the volume down significantly. But it also means that if you want to get through everything that you have to do within a training week, you have to pack that in to a short amount of time. Otherwise, you're totally going to miss out on certain exercises, which is probably not ideal. So the way I prefer to deload is by doing the usual things that I'm always doing. I'm doing the same exercises, but I'm dropping down the volume and the intensity. So the only thing that changes is that the frequency stays the same. The exercises are pretty much the same, unless I feel like I have to or want to try out a new exercise. A deload period is a great time to do that, because you're not going to be training hard anyways, so you're not really missing out on anything, and therefore it gives you a little bit of space to navigate through some exercises that you might find can be beneficial for you, and you can really figure out how to do them and how hard they are for you, and if they're gonna be beneficial, like do they actually feel good for you specifically. These are great things to try out during a deload. You need to remember that a deload is only a thing where your trainings should change. Your sleep still needs to be a top tier sleep. Nutrition should still be great, and you should still go into your trainings with focus. Otherwise, you are gonna see yourself suffer throughout the following weeks after the deload. When it comes to how often you should deload, there are many things to consider. Some of the most important are exertion or effort, volume, and frequency. Exertion or effort refers to how close to failure you're training. If you're training at an RPE 9, that's a really high effort. It is a 1 rep in the tank set, almost an all-out grinder. Volume refers to the total amount of sets times reps that you're doing, and frequency refers to how often you're training, but more specifically, how often you're training a specific exercise, and specifically, how often you're training that exercise with an intensity or effort that is going to require you to recover before being able to replicate the same amount of effort. Because you can't go into a training with an effort that is so low that it's not really going to be detrimental to recovery, where it's just a recovery workout. And we will see that many times in things like Westside Barbell, where they train at home and do extra stuff for their arms, where they do a lot of high rep curls or extensions, or they do sled work. These are not done at an extremely high effort. Instead, they actually enhance recovery. So when we are talking about frequency on a lift, we mean the amount of times we are hitting that lift with an effort and intensity that require us to recover, because it is actually taxing our central nervous system and breaking down muscle fibers to an amount where they're not going to be ready to produce the same the next day or within the next 48 hours or so. So when it comes to how often you should deload, if your exertion or effort, I'm going to refer to it as effort from now on, is higher, that obviously means you need to deload more often. Someone who is training more constantly at an RPE 9 will have to deload more often than someone with an average effort of RPE 7. But there's more things to it than that. The stronger you get, the less hard you can train, because you get better at turning on your motor, so to speak. Let's take an example of a beginner. When they walk into the gym, their reps are going to look sluggish. They're going to shake, even though we know that they're a lot stronger than that. It's just because they're not efficient at using their muscles properly. The motor unit recruitment is bad. So the more motor units you can recruit, that means that you're basically using the motor that you have more efficiently. And the better you are at that, the quicker you're also going to see a burnout from high effort. So let's say you have a motor that is able to go 300 kilometers an hour, but in the beginning, as a beginner, you only have the ability to actually press it and go 100 kilometers an hour. But as an really advanced athlete, you actually go these 300 kilometers an hour. And even though you are able to do more, it also means that it comes with a bigger risk of burning out. So training at an average RPE of 7 to 8 for a really strong athlete, one of the best in the world, might mean that they have to deload as often as a beginner who are training at RPE 9 to 10 often. It doesn't mean you can't train extremely hard without having to deload often, but you're going to have to dial back the volume and the frequency. You'll see Mike Men's are training this way, and a lot of people nowadays are taking up this trend, which is great. It's not a bad way to train. It's just not how I prefer to train with the goals I have, because they are more strength oriented. But for bodybuilding, it can be a very viable way to train. So if you want to train extremely hard, you might want to go down and only do 2 sets per exercise within a workout, and do that 2 times a week or 3 times a week. But instead of that, because the frequency is so low, you're taking all of these sets to failure. On the other hand, if you really want to do a lot of work and get a huge workload in by doing a ton of sets and having a high frequency, you will want to dial back the intensity and the effort a large amount, similar to what I'm doing right now with my Road to Anywhere squat program, where I'm squatting 5 times a week, where I just finished a block where I got 4 sets of 5 and a set of 7 with 200 kilos in the back squat. But my standard loads most often were 5x5 with 160 in the back squat. So that is only 80% of what I was capable of on the last day. So that just goes to show that if you want to have this high frequency and do 25 sets of different squat variations throughout the week, you have to dial back the effort and the intensity a large amount. Otherwise, that is not going to be possible. You can't have a high effort, a high volume, and high frequency all in the same program. How do you actually know that you need a deload? The simplest way to find out is if you're progressing or not. If you're simply not progressing and haven't done so for a couple of weeks, it's likely a sign that you need to deload. Sometimes you can get away with working in a different rep range or just changing up the exercise, which is known as the conjugate method. So you go from something like a barbell bench press to a dumbbell bench or to an incline, which still targets the same muscle, but is enough to place the stress elsewhere on the body, and then you can begin building up again. This is known as the conjugate method, which I will get more into later in this video because it has a lot of benefits in terms of allowing you to train harder with a higher average effort, even as a stronger athlete, and not need to deload extremely often. Another way to tell if you should deload or not is if you're having slight pain or discomfort. If that begins to develop, you might have to take some time off. Maybe it's not necessary for the whole body to be deloaded. It might just be that specific thing that you're having problems with. For example, I remember back in around June last year, I was struggling with my forearms, having a lot of overuse in them when doing things such as pull-ups, where I was using my grip and my forearm strength. And I didn't have any problems with the rest of my body, but I decided to take 2 weeks off completely from all pulling movements. And when I came back, I didn't have any pain at all, and to this date, it's still feeling really good. So I didn't deload anything else than my forearms, and this is a really good way to go about deloads, where you see, alright, this is where I have pain, I might have done too much, so this is the only thing that is not progressing right now, and the only thing that is in pain and where I feel discomfort. So everything can just be trained in the same way, but I just have to cut out everything that makes this flare up until I can train it again without developing pain. But here's the thing, if you know your body, you should never need to take these unplanned deloads because of pain and discomfort. You should be able to train without getting pain and discomfort. Unfortunately, most people never avoid that, which is often because the ego gets in the way and we want to hit a 1 rep max or do something, even though we know that it is not the best idea. We all know that we should not go extremely hard all the time, but it is not everyone that are able to regulate themselves and hold themselves accountable. I can say personally that throughout the last 2 or 3 years, I've only had one serious training injury, and that was a grade 2 hamstring tear in my right hamstring, but that also only lasted about 4 weeks before I was back into heavy training. And that mostly comes down to good effort regulation and fatigue management, where I make sure that I'm not doing too much. Over time, I've learned what my body is capable on and how I can train without getting overused. I've become better at taking things in the run-up. If I notice that something is beginning to flare up, I just take a little bit of a load off or just take it easier one day, and that way I don't need to take a full week or 2 weeks with lighter loads. Apart from that, I do a lot of conditioning, where you might call that prehab stuff, where I take things not just in the run-up, but I really work on things before there's even anything to be done there to avoid anything going on in the future. But the most important thing is just that you know how much average effort, intensity, volume, and frequency your body can handle. Apart from these 4, the other things are not as important in terms of how much you can recover from, but there are more things that are going to play an impact, such as the job that you have and the amount of sleep that you're getting and the quality of nutrition that you have. The worse your sleep are and the more stressful your job are and the less quality your nutrition are, the less effort intensity, volume and frequency you can put into the gym. Especially if your sleep is bad and if you're eating in a caloric deficit, that is the worst way to allow yourself to train hard consistently at the gym. On the other hand, if you're in a caloric surplus and bulking up, that will allow you to train much harder because your body has a surplus of energy that it can use to restore energy and build up new muscle tissue. Earlier in the video, I mentioned the Conjugate method, which is designed by the founder of Westside Barbell and now dead Louis Simmons, a big legend in strength sports and especially powerlifting.
And
The
also
Conjugate
that
method is basically
they
a
actually
method where you're
are
training
really good
concurrent, focusing
for
on
me to
different
begin with
qualities.
these.
You're
I'm
training
training
max
7.5
effort,
kg by
dynamic
hand.
effort, and
I've
repetition
got a
effort.
lot of weight,
Max effort
but I'm
is
performing these with
done with a high
extremely
exertion
good
or
form.
effort of
Like the weight is getting
around
really
9
far
to
up,
10 if you're doing it the
and
way
I'm pulling far
Westside were doing it
beyond my
back in the days.
yeah, my elbows are
After
going far
that, a lot
beyond
of
my
people
back.
have tried it
I
out
can see a lot of people
and
that
have come to the
maybe only pull
conclusion that you
like
can probably train at an exertion
5-10
of
centimeters
maybe
lower than
8.5
this when I do this
and still get
exercise.
the same benefit, but
So
with
that
less
is why probably
fatigue.
that
Matt Wenning is
I'm
one of
not as
those
strong
people
here
who got it from
as they are
a
when
guy
I'm
that
pulling
I
with
can't completely remember the name of, but he figured out that it was a quicker way to progress in the long run. When doing the max effort, you're not just training the same exercise every single week. Westside Barbell used to do it with squats and bench presses. So you would have a variety of different exercises within that movement pattern. So a squat is a movement pattern where we flex at the knees and flex at the hips and dorsiflex at the ankles. But the degree of which we do each of these things depends on where the load is placed. So, for example, in a low bar squat, you'll see people, when they do that, they're bending over a lot more at the hips and they're not getting as much dorsiflexion at the ankles and also not as much knee flexion at the knees. But if you look at a front squat instead, you're going to be much more upright. You're going to target your quads much more and less of your glutes. And what this does is that you can train the same movement pattern. These exercises are still very close to each other. So even though I'm saying that one is much more focused on the quads and one is much more focused on the glutes, it doesn't mean that there's no carryover in between them. They're still extremely similar in the muscles and the things that they train, the capabilities that they train. So when you are going between different exercises such as banded as well, band resisted squats are one of the best exercises you can do in the max effort method because it changes up the strength curve where squats are usually hardest in the bottom and become easier throughout the later at the top. When you're using a band, it adds weight in the top half and a lighter therefore in the bottom, which evens out the strength curve and allows you to grind for longer throughout a rep, which is important when you go into competition and you want to do one rep maxes that last maybe 3 or 4 seconds. With a band, you can train this way often. So what it really does, all of these things, is that it makes the exercise either hardest doing a different portion of the lift, or it makes you target slightly other structures. So you, for example, in the front squat and the low bar squat, in both of these you are using your knees obviously, but the low bar squat are harder when the knee is not as flexed and when the ankle is not as dorsiflexed, while the front squat is hardest where the knee is more flexed and with more dorsiflexion in the ankles. So this means that slightly other structures of the body is being targeted and it is harder in slightly different positions, which when doing these small changes over a long time means that you can avoid deloading totally. Whereas if you are just training at an RPE 9 to 9.5 with single reps for just 3 weeks in a row with the same exercise, you will begin to see a reduction in the weight you are able to lift. For more advanced trainees, that would even happen in the second week of maxing out on a specific variation of a lift. But by just rotating between different lifts, having like 10 different ones, and it doesn't have to be anything insane where you're putting on multiple bands and chains, there are a lot of different things you can do that are still close to a competition lift, such as doing paused reps, doing like block squats or where you go down on the bench and sit and go back up, front squat, SSB squat, camber bar squats. You can do pause reps in all of these variations. Use a single band. Use the Lyson method where the band comes from the top, so it helps more in the bottom and less at the top. There's so many things you can do without doing extremely crazy things. So that way you can get in enough variations to rotate these constantly and avoid deloading. The second thing that they do within the Conjugate method is what is known as the dynamic effort method, where you're using lighter weight and really focusing on the velocity. So you might do something like 12 sets of 2 reps with 60% of your max plus 15% of band tension at the top. So in the bottom, you have 60% of your max. At the top, you have 75% of your max. So it's not close to failure at all, but you're training with low rest, something around 45 seconds in between sets, and you're doing 12 sets of 2. So you're really working on your ability to just explode out of the bottom. And because you have the resistance bands on there, it forces you to be explosive throughout the entire range of motion, and you will get a kinetic effect because the bands store energy on the way down that pulls you quicker down than you usually would, and that way you are going to make more use of a stretch reflex, and this kinetic energy is going to be released on the way up, which means that you might be able to move faster than if you are just actually using normal 60% rather than the added 15% at the top from the band. The last thing and really important thing that they do at Westside Barbell is what they call the repetition effort method. This is what you would usually see bodybuilders do. And this is now where we're going to come into what I've talked about earlier with rotating exercises. If you're starting to stagnate and not progressing the amount that you would like to. Because what they do is usually build up an exercise over 3 to 4 weeks. Here we're talking about accessory lifts that are not squat, bench, or deadlift. And after 3 to 4 weeks, then change to another exercise that are basically the same movement pattern, but because it's slightly different, it allows you to target again slightly other structures and avoid overtraining. It might be that for 4 weeks you have done Romanian deadlifts. Now you go over to some 45-degree hybrids instead, where you are still training the hip extension and using your hamstrings and glutes, things like that. But it's enough of a change for you to again build up in weight over 4 weeks or 3 weeks, something around there. And even though it's a small change, it is enough novelty to allow you to get a refresh in your mindset and motivation and energy levels, and allow some of the structures that have been worn down to heal up again while still improving. And then later on, when you get back to your Romanian deadlifts, you will definitely see that they are stronger than they have been before, and you can keep going through this cycle with any exercise basically. Simple things even as going from a preacher curl for your biceps and then going over to some weeks of incline curls or hammer curls, just small changes like that. You're going to use a different grip, for example, which might place less stress on the forearms or a little bit other structures of your wrist, and that is going to make a big difference in the long run. Some people might look at Conjugate as a kind of auto-regulation. I wouldn't say that it necessarily is. I don't completely agree. What auto-regulation is where you are basically fluctuating the load that you're using, the intensity that you're training with, and so on, depending on how you're feeling on every single training day. So you will go in and warm up, and if you're noticing you're feeling quite bad on that day and probably can't hit the load that were prescribed, you go a little bit lighter, so you avoid basically overtraining, because if you're not auto-regulating, you might end up trying to go for that load you had prescribed, and you might be able to do it because it was prescribed at an effort of RPE 7, but you end up doing it at an RPE 9 because you are not auto-regulating. Now, you can also, if you know your body really well, auto-regulate without having the need to really change anything up on the day, which is mostly how my training is, where I really put in like some easy workouts on some days. If I'm squatting 5 times a week, most of my workouts are obviously easy, and then I just go harder whenever I know that it's a good time to do that in the program. It's not auto-regulated in the sense that I change things up as I go into the weight room, but it's not really a planned out thing where I have to follow the schedule 100%. The last thing to be said about training without the need for deloads is having recovery workouts and conditioning. Recovery workouts might be something like just at home doing 3 sets of 50 banded good mornings, 3 sets of 50 banded bicep curls, or 3 sets of 50 banded tricep extensions. While this sounds like a lot of reps, it shouldn't be hard at all. What you should only do is enhance your blood flow. By enhancing blood flow, more blood will go into the muscles.
That much,
and especially when using bands,
I've been focusing more on just
that becomes
recovering,
get
and
high tension.
Just been quite busy.
The further they are stretched out,
sometimes
that means that during the contraction, the band is hardest, which is where most blood will get into the muscle. So that for that reason, bands are extremely good when it comes to recovery workouts, and in that way, decreasing the need for deloads. It might sound counterintuitive, but that is what happens when you are actually doing a little bit more work, because you can look at it as the same way as walking, that is not extremely difficult, but can help you enhance recovery the same way sauna can as well. In terms of conditioning, what conditioning will do is allow you to handle a higher workload. With higher workload and more resilient joints and targeting muscles specifically that are put under a lot of heavy loads usually, you're building up more muscle and capacity and resilience in those places specifically. The reason I do backward sled is because I know that when I'm squatting, I bounce out of the hole to make use of the stretch reflex. And that places a ton of stress on the Achilles tendon and the calf. So I find that when I do backward sled, I really get a lot of blood flow in that part, and I just do a lot of work that is not extremely fatiguing, but it helps me avoid getting injured from all the bouncing, because the muscle is used to handle loads over a long amount of time, even if it's different from the kind of like really quick loads, quick heavy loads that are a lot heavier than the ones in the backwards sled walking. So even though they're a lot heavier, just the fact that I have more capacities and I'm more resilient down there means that it won't be as bad when it comes. So my final advice would be to find ways that you can work around the need for deloads. You might need easier periods of training no matter what. If you're training 5 times a week, the same movement, the same exercise, you have to obviously have lighter periods, but you might not need to completely deload and drop weight off, especially not unplanned. There are many ways to work around it. The Conjugate method, recovery workouts, autoregulation, and conditioning. These are all very viable ways to extend how long you can train without needing to deload. Mastering these things and finding out what works for you is a long process, but learning how you program most optimally for yourself in the long run is going to guarantee you gains. So take your time and sit down and figure these things out, or go through the videos that I have on my channel, which will help you on the way. That is going to be all for this video, and I'll see you all for the next one. Peace out.